Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg, and friend. Today is one of our periodic mailbag episodes. Because I bring 3 decades of leadership and consulting experience, building, growing, leading, and yes, repairing organizations, I often get questions from people within my community. These are questions from friends who listen to the podcast or the blog, as well as from clients, prospective clients, and of course, folks who just find me on Google and are never going to listen to the podcast, read a blog post, or be a client. I try to answer every question that I receive, though honestly, it can take me a little bit of time to respond because I always prioritize providing great service to my current clients. And sometimes that means a few weeks. And I'm ashamed to say in a couple cases, it's meant a couple months until I've got the time to really sit down and think about the right response to a really tricky problem. In the past year, I've not just started to send an email with a written response, but I've also started to send a video answer to folks who reach out with questions. So I thought it would be really cool to use the audio from those videos to create a mailbag episode. Essentially, these are questions that I've already responded to, and with some light editing, I'm able to anonymize them and use them here in the mailbag. So, friend, the theme of this mailbag episode is board members behaving badly. Now, as I've already said, I have lightly edited my responses to fully anonymize the person asking the question and their organization. And I wanted to say that twice so that you know if you send me a question, I am going to be very respectful of your confidentiality and your privacy. Now, as you can imagine, I've recorded both of the two answers in today's show at different times. And what that means is the audio quality will be a smidge less polished than what you're used to, because honestly, I normally record the answer to those questions sitting at my desk with a Blue Yeti mic, which is not quite as good as what I use when I actually record the podcast. But to be honest, friend, the content is just too good to not share. And with that, my friend, let's get to the very first question, which is someone we'll call Ted, who sent me the following email. And by the way, I'm pretty much reading the email verbatim, so it might not sound the way either I talk or maybe even the way Ted would normally talk, because the way we write is different, well, from how we speak. Here's the email. On my board of directors that I am the president of, we have a conflict between a board member and others in the organization more than occasionally. I spend time refereeing and trying to mediate the personalities that I feel is excessive. This takes away from the time I can spend fundraising, being out in the community, talking to, educating, and bringing in support for our organization. Dolph, can I take a stand that I will not make that part of my responsibility when the ones in conflict will not even try to find a solution first? Thanks for your insight. That's Ted's question, and here is my lightly edited answer. Before I answer your question, let me just start by saying, way to go. I am so glad that you are thinking about your board leadership and your board service in such a way that you're saying, hey, I'm spending so much time on these petty interpersonal issues between these two board members that it's taking away from my ability to be a good governor, a good ambassador, and a good fundraiser for the organization. Now, regarding your question itself, I think that I probably have 3 answers for you. One is a short-term answer, the other is a middle term, and then finally a longer-term answer. But let's start with short-term. So in the near term, I would be very clear with both of those two board members that they can escalate together, but that they cannot come to you separately to gripe or complain about the other person. Period. Full stop. There is no world where they can come to you and complain without the other person. Now, there's one notable exception, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So essentially what this means is that you are going to start asking them to escalate together. And that's a concept that Kim Scott outlines in her book, Radical Candor. And I'll share with you that it's a technique I have used in my professional and my volunteer roles for years. And this is a technique that works wonders. Now, instead of an individual coming to me and complaining, I require that they first try to work this out with the other person. And only then, if they can't work it out, can they schedule time to jointly discuss the issue with me. In scheduling that time, they need to approach me together. So one person cannot come to me and say, Dolph, I'm escalating together and need to get time on your calendar for me and this other person. No, that's not the way it works. Now, I also schedule 30 minutes for the escalate together meeting, and I serve as a facilitator, not an adjudicator. I am super clear about that. Do not want to end up being the judge. I just want to help the two of you work it out, ideally with me just kind of being there on the sidelines. And for this reason, I will almost always start the meeting with just a simple question or statement and ask each person to share with me what brings us to that meeting today. And throughout this short 30-minute meeting, my main goal, frankly, is just to keep them from interrupting each other and also to keep them on track and being collaborative and solution oriented. The vast majority of the time, and I'm talking like 90% of the time, the two individuals are actually able to work it out by the end of this meeting. And in my head, I always laugh a little bit about this because really the role I end up playing is pretty minimal. Normally, I ask that question. Sometimes I keep them from interrupting each other and maybe ask a couple additional probing questions. But, it is interesting because for the most part, it's just my presence there that helps the two of them act more mature and really figure out how they are going to solve the problem themselves. It's almost like now that I'm in the room, they realize, oh yeah, we have to be on our best behavior. Now, in those rare situations, and when I say rare situations, I mean like 1 out of 10 times that I do actually need to have a judgment and say, okay, well, apparently I am going to have to adjudicate this. I make it really clear that that's a failure on all our parts. That if we can't work this out as adults, and I actually need to essentially render a decision, that's a failure. That we all have to figure out how we're going to work together without a third party having to arbitrate for us. I'd mentioned that there is one notable exception, and let me just underscore that now. If the issue is legal in nature, I do not require the complaining person to escalate together. If they, in good faith, believe that someone is breaking the law, they need to reach out and let me know. Now, the biggest hang-up that I see my coaching clients have with escalating together is someone will approach them, either schedule some time to be on a Zoom or stop by their office and just start talking to them about this other person. And suddenly they get sucked in. And some people are really good at sucking us in on their own drama. So what I try to do to enforce my escalate together rule is when someone comes to me with a complaint about a colleague or anybody really, I will listen politely for about 5 minutes and I will do my best to not interrupt or weigh in. And I got to share with you, that's hard for me. That's really, really hard. But literally, I'll just let them talk themselves out, but I typically won't let them go more than about 5 minutes. Once the person takes a pause, I remind them about escalating together. And then I also ask them if they have questions about how to escalate together. Every now and then, the person will say to me, I'm escalating together right now. That's why I'm here. And that's an opportunity for me to reiterate the principles of escalating together, that they both need to come to me together and at the same time. At some point, by the way, I have normally found that the frequent flyers, those people who will come in and complain a lot about one or two other people, after I've reminded them about escalating together 5 or 6 times, they might come to me and they'll start and then they'll say, stop. And they'll say, oh, I bet I need to escalate together, don't I? And I normally smile and nod my head and say, yeah, you probably should be escalating together right now. And that's it. And then the really great part of this is normally most people don't come to me 8 or 9 or 10 times because they know what the answer is going to be. The answer is going to be, well, where's the other person? I need you to escalate together. One final thing that I every now and then will see my coaching clients get wrapped up in is the person will say, well, can we escalate together now? Can you go and get that person? Or can I go and get that person? And my answer is always no. There are many reasons for that, but here are the two big reasons. The first is escalating together needs to be scheduled at a time when everyone is in a place emotionally and bandwidth wise, i.e., this is not a day with a lot of deadlines for them, etc., that they can actually have this conversation. The second reason, though, is if I allow myself to get sucked in, oh, yeah, let's go get that person right now, or yeah, why don't you go get that person and bring them in? Suddenly, they're being called in to the principal's office, and that's not fair to them. This is no, you need to go have a conversation with that person. And some dialogue that I will sometimes suggest to say, hey, I feel like we've both acted in good faith in trying to work this out, and we've just not been able to. So I'd like for you and I to escalate together to Dolph. That verbiage, when used, no longer feels like we're trying to jump over someone's head. It no longer feels like you're being called into the principal's office. Literally, it's just, hey, it feels like you and I are having a hard time working this out. Let's see if we can get someone else to help us. So that's your short-term solution. Now, this is the midterm solution. And this one, by the way, is probably the most difficult solution of them all. But the reason I'm going to take the stand that I'm about to tell you is because board service is hard. And it is unfair for these individuals, colleagues on the board, to have to serve with two folks who, frankly, are acting like kindergartners, and not good kindergartners that get all satisfactories on their report card. We're talking about those kindergartners that get needs improvement on some key skills, things like playing well with others, sharing, and not pooping in the sandbox. And maybe that's not actually on the kindergarten report card. Maybe there's no line that says, doesn't poop in the sandbox, but you better believe that the kid who's dropping a deuce so that others cannot play in the sandbox is going to receive a needs improvement on lots of those report card lines. But those two board members who can't act like adults, they shouldn't be on your board. I'm going to say this again. Two board members who can't figure out how to put aside whatever differences they have and work together collegially, they can't be on your board. Admittedly, I don't know how many board members you have. So if you've only got 4 board members and these two are half of your board, it might be easier for me to suggest this than it is to actually do it. Last year, though, I wrote a blog post about how to fire a board member, and I've linked it here. And since I'm also recording this for the podcast, I'm going to link it in the show notes as well. There's also a bonus break on how to fire a board member, and I'm going to link to both the Apple and the Spotify episodes of that bonus break. Because getting these two off your board, it might involve some pain, but it is going to save you years of heartache and angst. It will also help you retain those good board members who you want to keep. Because I'll tell you, that kind of drama runs the best board members off. They're not willing to put up with it. And lastly, I promised you a long-term solution. Before I share that solution, let me just say that I have certainly recruited people to a board who I thought were going to dazzle, and they ended up just being a big frazzle. And to prevent this from happening, I realized that we need to do a better job of vetting our board members before we put them on the board. And what we've started to do at Successful Nonprofits is we now actually offer board recruitment and onboarding services. I'm not saying you should be using our services, but I just want to share with you the model that we use. We have started making onboarding a requirement that must be completed before being appointed to the board. And that onboarding should be cohort based. It should be multi-sessions, and it also should have homework. This way, you can see if people follow through on their commitments, if they're working well with their colleagues in their cohort, and if they treat staff and other people respectfully. Putting onboarding before actually appointing someone to the board has been a game changer for our clients, and it will help you ensure that you get the right board members. Those are board members that save their energy and the energies of all the other board members for the important work of board service. Those things that you mentioned to me in your email, fundraising, being a good governor for the organization, and being a good ambassador. I really hope that this was helpful. Ted, if you're listening to this episode, I would love for you to reach back out and share with me how that advice worked out for you. Now, with the theme of board members behaving badly, I'd like to share this email from someone I have renamed Jen to protect her confidentiality. Jen had just subscribed to my email newsletter, which, by the way, friends, if you've not subscribed to, please go to successfulnonprofits.com and subscribe to the newsletter. I might even put a link in the show notes so you can just scroll down on your phone and do it. But anyway, Jen had just subscribed to the email newsletter, and she replied to that welcome email asking for some resources about a bitter board situation. Now, I didn't have great resources to offer her, so instead, I shared my candid advice and thoughts about repairing the damage that disruptive and destructive board members can have on an organization. Here's Jen's email. Dear Dolph, thank you. I found your website Googling about difficult board members, and you had some really good resources. Let me know if you have some podcasts or blogs about repairing the damage wreaked on the organization by a destructive board president and/or board members. Many thanks in advance, Jen. Friends, like Jen, most of us have experienced that destructive and disruptive board member. And here is my answer to Jen. First of all, thank you so much for signing up for the email newsletter. I am super glad that you did. Second, I also wanted to just personally respond to your question. So you asked me, hey, how can we repair the damage wreaked on our organization by a destructive board president or destructive board members? I'm going to start the answer by saying that I'm assuming you have already gotten rid of the destructive board chair or the destructive board members. And I'm going to make that assumption. If you've not, I've got a great blog post about how to fire a board member and would strongly suggest that you take a look at that blog post. But once they have left, I think that really becomes the time to heal and to rebuild. So once those counterproductive folks have left your organization, the first thing to do is, number one, do not ignore the elephant in the room. As a group, the board should talk about the ways that your board dynamics changed as a result of that individual who really kind of warped communication and behavior throughout the board. And then again, as a group, as you're starting to acknowledge that, commit to fixing those dynamics. Now, that leads us to number two, and I believe the way to fix it is to discuss and agree on behavioral norms for all board members. And let me say, there's small things like, for example, how are people going to respond to email and how quickly, but also big things like we're going to treat each other collegially. We're going to give ourselves and other people the benefit of the doubt, that we're going to be kind. We might be direct, but we're going to be kind and direct when we are talking to people or about people. The third is it's going to be critically important to align on three different types of roles: the board roles, the staff roles, and the shared roles. So often what I find is that when we see a board warp itself around some counterproductive or destructive board members, also what starts to happen is staff are suddenly starting to having to play some board roles. Board members are micromanaging or stepping in and playing staff roles. So this is a time to sit down and go, okay, let's list out. These are the things that the executive director and the executive director staff should be doing. And now let's list out, these are the things that the board members and the board and its committees should be doing. And then you've got this shared set of responsibilities. Sometimes that's things like the audit, because the board is responsible for appointing the auditor, but the executive director and or the executive director's staff is responsible for working with the auditor. So, on all of those shared items, to spend the time and talk about how we're going to share that work. Who's the responsible decision maker? Who's the person that implements those decisions? That is really going to be critical. And then the last thing is, I want your board to return to healthy meeting practices as quickly as possible. And when I say healthy meeting practices, I mean meetings happening as scheduled, there being an agenda for every committee meeting and every board meeting, that your committee meetings and your board meetings are board member led, not staff led. And I also mean that you've got strong participation. So if 2/3 of your board is absent, or even if 1/3 of your board is always absent, that's a problem. And that's not a healthy meeting practice. So those are my 4 tips to you. I'm just going to summarize. First of all, don't ignore the elephant in the room. Have the conversation. Talk about the ways in which your board changed because of that person. Second of all, discuss and agree on behavioral norms for all board members. Third, align on board roles, staff roles, and shared roles. And finally, do not forget to return to healthy meeting practices. And if you can do those 4 things, your organization is going to find a new normal. And in that new normal, your board is going to start to really be productive and productively support the organization and the organization's leadership. I hope this is helpful. I know it took me a couple days to respond to you. I'm sorry for that, but I'm super glad that I've had the opportunity to. Thanks again, and I always want you to know you can reach out. Hopefully, my answers to Ted and Jen provide you some help and guidance on dealing with that difficult, disruptive, or even detrimental and destructive board member that you are currently experiencing. And if you're thinking, Dolph, I don't experience a difficult board member, well, trust me, my friend, if you are in this sector long enough, you will experience that person. Now it's your turn. What question can I answer for you? And just to be clear, your questions don't have to be about just the board. You can send me questions about staff, volunteers, leadership issues, finance, ethical dilemmas that you're facing, and more. I am happy to share my candidate advice with you first. And of course, I will potentially anonymize that. I don't do this with everyone, but I might anonymize it and include it in a mailbag episode. And one final thing, in case you're wondering, that sounds great, Dolph, but how do I actually reach you? Simple. My email is dolph@successfulnonprofits.com. And you can email me your question, or you can email me about anything else. Dolph@successfulnonprofits.com arrives at my laptop in my personal inbox. Finally, friend, I promised you a few links in the show notes that you can find at successfulnonprofits.com, or you could just scroll down right there on your phone. That's right, the phone where you're listening to this episode, you can scroll down inside this episode and you will find the following links. First of all, that blog post about how to fire a board member. Second, how to fire a board member bonus break. And the bonus break are those short podcast episodes that I do that are solo that really provide you some additional help, advice, coaching, etc. Number 3, if you are looking for some consulting help with your board, whether that's a board retreat, a training, or even a board recruitment project, I've linked to the section of our website that talks about our board development services. And finally, I mentioned that Jen reached out to me after subscribing to my weekly newsletter. And by the way, that made me realize that I should include a link to subscribe in the show notes. The newsletter does more than just share with you what's happening on the podcast and the blog that week. It also includes things like our incredibly popular Shareworthy section. That's essentially a weekly section that includes cool articles, videos, and podcasts that are unique and interesting. If I find myself going down a rabbit hole researching something, going, oh my gosh, this is cool. Oh wow, I can't believe this is so awesome. Well, guess what? Those things typically make it into the share-worthy section. And periodically in the newsletter, I include templates that we have developed here at Successful Nonprofits, opportunities for funding, job postings, and other bonus content. The link to sign up for the newsletter is also in these show notes. That, my friend, is our episode for this week. I hope that you have gained some insight to help you and your nonprofit thrive. And now it's time for that lawyer-required disclaimer. I'm not an accountant nor an attorney, and neither I nor the consulting practice provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This podcast, you know what I'm about to say, it's for informational purposes only. You know what else I'm about to say. That means you shouldn't rely on it for tax, legal, or accounting advice. If that's what you need, find a licensed, qualified professional in your region and get the help you need.